Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be painting out Magik for Marvel Crisis Protocol. So I've got Magik here, and like most of the models I have painted up, it's primed gray and I dry brushed that white. Typically, that's what I use for working with contrast paints. It provides us enough of a base, and then that white gives a good enough highlight. You'll notice here a lot of her skin and stuff, it's really sort of difficult to work with. Unlike my other miniatures that can use pretty much the base coat working with that, here, a lot of the skin, I'm going to have to work with white. And she also has a lot of black on her uniform, so that's what I'll be going ahead and going through. Like her uniform itself is using black. And for all that skin, I need to get probably a base coat of white. I find that typically works best, especially with using some of the flesh tones. So I'll be using fairy skin there for that. And also for her hair, really to make that yellow stand out, I found probably getting a good base coat, maybe with a lighter yellow. Here I'm going to be using tan yellow, and that'll be the base for her hair. So that'll be pretty much what I'm going to do for the foundation of a lot of those base coats, is that black, get white for whatever skin tone is going to be sticking out, and of course that yellow for her hair. And after that, probably just give another dry brush of white, especially over her hair, and I think that'll lay down the foundation. So I've gone ahead and painted out those base coats. And you can see for a uniform, I've got that black coat down. That's going to be basically the base coat for that. And, working on her hair, as I mentioned, I used a base of tan yellow. I went ahead and dry brushed that white to really add that extra contrast there. And I did the same thing to just make sure the skin tone for her skin, also making that a base of white. It just seems like when you work with these Vallejo paints, especially the flesh tones, I think specifically, they're a little translucent. And so for those flesh tones, especially for fairy skin, I think, rather than having like a gray primer and dry brushing, really it's just not that opaque. So it's best to use white. And so I've gone ahead here, and I'm just, as I typically do with contrast paints, just try to paint in one section at a time and just try to be, as thorough as possible. And I find that, this is a lovely pink color. It's a lovely skin tone for just a lighter flesh. This adds just amount of depth in, some of those crevices and stuff like that to make her muscles a little more defined, but, still leave just a lighter tone for some of her raised areas. And I find it's a really good skin color to work with if you want to get, like maybe a lighter skin tone on a model. So I'm just carefully working through here, just trying to get all the skin that she's got. So I've got that base down for her skin. Really like the way the Express contrast looks. You can bring out a lovely flesh tone for her on her midriff and stuff. So now I'm going to be working on her hair. And for that, again, I'll be using Imperial Yellow. And, having this base coat of tan yellow and then that dry brush of white, that just adds enough texture there to really make the yellow stand out. So it looks like she's got some, lovely blonde hair. And it's pretty easy to work with. And I think, just probably one coat should be enough. It is a little translucent, that Imperial Yellow, but I think, having that base just really helps add a little bit more depth to the color. And then, that dry brush of white just gives you just the right amount of highlight for it. And so, there we go. We've got that done. And I, painted it up, that yellow. Like her hair, I really like the way it looks. So now I'm going to be looking at her armor there, and I really want to make that stand out. So I'm just going to go ahead and use silver. I'm not even going to add in a different shade of that sort. As always, I mentioned, make sure you have separate water for metallic paint. I even have a separate palette. I always want to make sure I don't get any metal flakes in my regular paint, so that's why I always keep those separate and use individual ones specifically for metallic paints. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and cover up our armor section with that bright silver. There's not really much contrast, but that's sort of what I want. And I think, typically, I think in the comics too, she's just got this really, really bright, shiny armor. And so I just really want to make that stand out more. So I'm just going to use this silver paint and go through that and just give her the right amount of color. And this paint, it covers up pretty well. Just going to try to carefully go through this and make sure I can get all that section armor painted up with that base coat of silver. So I've got that done now, and you can see it. I want to make it stand out just a little bit more for her uniform and stuff. So I'm going to be using dark blue gray. And what I find with this is, of course, obviously as you paint up black, you want to have something that's just a little different for that. You want to make that stand out a little bit more. So you need to have just some highlights for that. I think that dark blue gray is really good for that. It just adds that subtle amount of gray. It's not too light, but it just provides just enough contrast. And I have this thinned down pretty well, and I'm just going to try to carefully get areas I think that look like it captures light. Something like you probably see with leather too. You look at black leather, it's not like completely black. You get some light source on it, you're going to have some shiny parts that sort of reflect a little bit of that light. And so I'm going to use this just to give a little bit of subtle definition to some of our areas and really giving off a little bit more highlight. So I'm just going to carefully go along the model, and the idea is maybe to look at from the top down and sort of see what catches that light normally, and that's what I would probably use just to get those bits. So now I've got that covered down, and you can see I've highlighted out her uniform. The next thing now I'm going to work on her flesh itself, and I'm going to be using dark flesh, a mix of that with the fairy skin, just about a 1-to-1 mix there. And I have that thinned down pretty well. And the idea is I want to just get a little bit more highlights, a little bit more to show off some of the definition on her torso and stuff, and maybe on her thighs, a lot of part of her thighs. So just like what I'm doing with her leather uniform and using the gray, I'm going to do the same thing with this thinned down paint. It's a mix of the two, again, the dark flesh and from that fairy skin. And the idea here is just to try to get some areas that are a little bit raised out, especially on her face. I pick out the bridge of her nose and along the line of her jaw and her chin and her cheekbones, just to add a little bit more definition and have that sort of stand out. So, and her face especially, I think it's a little bit harder to work with. It's a little bit more of a smaller area, but I'm just going to try to carefully go through here and not mess up too much, hopefully, and just sort of pick out those highlights using that color. So I've got that down. Really, I like the way her uniform looks. Adding that gray just adds a nice touch there. Of course, along her skin tones too. And now I'm going to work on her armor and make that stand out. Here I'm just going to use a pretty extreme contrast. I'm just going to use white paint and just try to thin that out quite a bit. And this, again, the idea is just to carefully pick out areas I think that we're going to capture a lot of light. Just along the top part of her armor, just some really light touches here and there. And, that extreme silver reflective amount, adding that bit of white there on those highlights just really makes that stand out a little bit more. So rather than, trying to add shade to that and then maybe dry brushing a silver over a other darker metallic, or maybe using silver that's been, has a wash on it, a dark wash, I'm just going to go ahead and just pick out those highlights. And the idea is just really make that gauntlet, that armor that she has on her shoulder and such, really stand out quite a bit. So that's what I'm carefully do is paint out the corners of there, the spikes, and this the top part of her armor, and really add quite a bit of highlight to that section. So now I've got that painted up and added the highlight. Now I'm going to be working on her sword itself. And for here, it's sort of been a challenge. I want to try to maybe not use a super bright color. So I'm just going to be using different shades here of maybe gray and of blues. I'm going to start out with Templar White, moving the space gray, and then finally end up with Storm Blue. And the idea is just to have a little bit of a transition between those. And I'm going to go ahead and use space gray first for her blade. Obviously, you see the comics and stuff like that. It's usually really, really, really super bright blue, but I think it's such a large part of the model. I think it's almost going to stand out too much that you can be looking more at her sword than maybe at the rest of her figure. I sort of shied away from using too much of a lighter color. I'm just going to try to use this lighter blue, make it a little bit more subtle. I'm just going to go ahead and give it a base coat of using this contrast paint and cover through most of the area. And just try to be very careful. Of course, if you make some mistakes, that's fine. That's probably what I'll end up doing, is going back and doing a retouch a little bit on the sword. But that's going to go ahead and work through using that color. And I've used a couple brushes here, for some of the other areas, I'm using more of a traditional brush. But of course, if I'm getting up to larger sections of her sword, that's when you want to have a little bit more of that paint that's in the bristles. So I'm going to be moving to a larger brush to work with that. I'm just going to carefully go through and work through her sword and just give that base coat. And that's what's going to be the initial color that I have, is just using that space gray express paint. And of course, you can see here, I'm going to have to take a little break because I have a little furry visitor that usually breaks up my paint time. Okay, cat break's over. So now I'm going to be working on this. And Rather than like maybe working from the sword and like on down to the base of that, I'm going to go from the other end here. Now I'm going to use the storm blue, and that's going to be sort of like the center of her teleportation circle. And I'm going to just try to work the bottom area of that, like the center of her base, and then that's at the very bottom of that too. And I'm just going to work through using that initial shade and just sort of see where maybe in the middle I think I might want to stop. And so I'm just going to carefully go through the areas here, but I think it'd be sort of the center of this teleportation circle that she has. And that's going to be my darkest shade, so that's what I'm going to be able to use. And it's a very lovely color, covers very well, and it sort of gets into those little areas, a little bit more of the deeper recesses that bring out a little bit more intense blue. But I have that dry brush there too, so in the other areas, it's thinned out pretty well, and it gets a little more translucent, a little bit lighter. So I think it adds a very nice color. And it's a little bit more of a subtle shift in colors between those three. So I think that this blue is going to work out. That's going to try working. We're not too sure exactly 100% how it's going to be, but I think it's going to work out pretty well. Hopefully. We'll see as I keep painting. Now that I have the center part of her base painted out for that storm blue, I'm going to be go ahead and moving up to using space gray. And for that, I'm going to do initially a mix of storm blue and space gray, about a 50-50 mix. And that's going to sort of be my transition from the center of her base, the center of that teleportation circle that we've got, and sort of work my way outwards. And it's going to be a fair transition there. It's better than just probably just switching to that space gray. But the idea here is just to get a subtle transition, just a little bit of blending in those colors there. And, this is thinned out quite a bit. And so basically I'm just working along the edges of that, and just a fair section in there, just try to lay down this base coat. And the idea is just to give a little bit of a subtle transition and color, a little bit of blending. And the idea here is just to reduce that contrast between just using those two paint colors by using this intermediate mix of the two. And I'm just going to sort of carefully go through this area here, just try to be as thorough as I can and cover up areas that I think that be sort of a transition between those two, and just carefully pick that out. And it's a little difficult because these are some really spindly parts of the model, and it's very smooth, and there's really not that much texture with it on itself in the model. Like there's not really a lot of raised edges or really deep sharp crevices, and so it's ornate, but it's not doesn't capture that much detail. And so I'm just going to try to carefully go through this, and that's what I'm going to be using to try to pick out those two. And now that I've got that blending down, now I'm going to be pretty much working on the other areas that I haven't painted over, and I'm just going to be using space gray itself. This is going to be the longer edges of those spindles that sort of flow out from her teleportation circle. I've got those areas there. That's what we're pretty much going to work on here, is that covering itself with that space gray and just giving a nice even coat as much as I can, as well as possible as I can. And this is going to provide a little bit of that subtle transition. And that's what I'm going to be working through here. Just being careful, trying not to get too much into other areas. And it's a little difficult here. You've got these larger sections. You really just want to try to make sure that you're go ahead and giving that a good even coat. So I've got the base of her sword here. There's a little bit of that transition between, I guess, that teleportation energy and her sword somewhat. And so I'm just carefully giving a coat. And the idea here too is, of course, that's a little bit of that transition between her blade and what I have here for her teleportation circle. It's a little subtle, this different colors. So I really found I didn't need to really blend it that much. And I think it worked out pretty well. And finally, just a little bit more touch-ups, maybe just on the edges there. And I think that gives a pretty good look overall. So here you go. I've got that transition between the center part of her teleportation circle and moving it through. And one way to give it a little bit more of a uniform color all throughout here is I'm going to go ahead and use Pastel Blue and be doing that just as a highlight. And, the concept is of course, you could just use different colored highlights as a lighter shade, and you could really have that nice, really subtle transition of shades between all those. But to unify this a little bit, to bring it maybe a bit of a more uniform color, I'm going to go ahead and use that pastel blue, and I'm going to be using it as a highlight. So I'm going to be highlighting the edge of her blade and the longer spindles of her teleportation circle. I'm going to go ahead and use this. And it's thinned down pretty well. And the idea here, I'm just using a filbert brush, is just to give it a really light dusting on the edges and stuff, and some of the raised edges inside that teleportation circle itself. And the idea here is to bring out some highlight of that, just to add a little bit more texture to it, but make it a little bit more uniform. So now here, I really want to make the edge of that blade stand out a little bit more. So now I'm going to be using a 50-50 mix of pastel blue and white. And here then, I'm just going to be adding another layer of highlights on, just to pick out, especially like the edges of her blade and other areas that just a little bit more on the tips of the spindles of her teleportation circle. And just using a very careful dry brush at that. Another thing too, to add a little bit more of a dynamic color, I'm sort of going to be using a dry brush as broad strokes to give her blade just this shining look. And so I'm going to be using this lighter color here, and especially emphasizing the edges, and use that to really bring out a little bit more life to that blade and make it stand out a little bit more. So I'm just going to carefully go along the edges of her sword and give that broad brush strokes along the flat of the blade, just to give a little more texture, just some little more detail working with that. And what's sort of interesting about this model is it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to match it. It's so pronounced one side of the blade or the other. Pretty much, you're never really going to see both sides at the same time. And so if you have it going in a different direction, that's not really a worry. I think that this adds just a little touch to the blade to make it stand out a little bit more. Looks like it's like a shimmering energy look. And I sort of like the way that turned out. And you can see here, I'm just getting pretty much the tips of her teleportation circle there. It's giving a little bit more of a lighter highlight in just a couple of key places. I don't want to do it too much. I don't want to make that stand out dramatic color. And so I'm just going to carefully do this here. I think that's just a little bit more to add a bit more dynamic color to that. So I'm just going to carefully pick out some areas in the interior too, and just really give it just a really fine highlight for a couple of places there. Just got to be careful and just not try to get in the crevices or anything like that, because then you're pretty much going to start all over. So I'm just going to be very careful here and just try to get the upper edges to make that stand out and maybe look like it's shimmering energy. And that's it. That's done. I probably didn't show this, but I also painted silver on her belt buckle to make that stand out. And of course, to get her little symbol there on her shoulder of the X-Men, I've used plasma red and got that painted up. Now, of course, on the base too, I've used Greasy Black just to make those cracks stand out. I used a nameless craft paint just to give it a bit of a dry brush there and finish that up. And so that's the model. I like the way this sort of turned out. I really didn't want to bring up too much emphasis on the blade, so I sort of used some very subtle blue colors there. And I sort of like that transition I've got. It's just a little bit of a deeper blue in the center on out to a lighter point. I really like the way, I did those edge highlights and sort of added some of those brush strokes onto that blade to make it sort of look like it's a shimmering energy weapon. But really, the idea is that you're looking at the figure. The blue is a very subtle transition. And of course, using that same color highlight all throughout really does make that blend in a little bit more. And so I think I like it. I think it turned out really well. Can't wait to get her on the tabletop.